Hi, and let's pick off where we left off talking about the little Padlet there, a group communal mapping exercise. I'll switch over to that tab and we can look at that map. So it allows you to just use this little pink plus button in the bottom right corner and add some different waypoints, so to speak, of areas around the world that I was hoping you could add some based on what stands out to you of examples of what we're talking about this week. And there's a lot of them right within our discussion board from the mini lecture yesterday. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone's responses there and your dialogue amongst each other as well. I figured I'd take a little bit here just to go over some of the common themes that I saw come up and give some feedback and further thoughts. Uh, and just keep it, fairly anonymous for the old YouTube, but feel free to cross-reference back um, to the board. That's why I've left some of these quotes in the broader context. But yeah, from quite early on in the board, one student saying, "I've traveled to some of the most rural areas of Africa, and yet I always find someone speaking broken English to me as a joke. And when I ask them where they learned it, uh, they always not some kind of cultural influence. I don't think people realize how far globalization has went. So thanks for the reminder there." And keep scrolling on there. This content always predominantly is in English, wherever it came from, America or the UK. And we can think of a lot of other countries that are predominantly English as well, um, and have a large influence on other parts of the global South or other parts of the world. But this is so poignant here. Thanks a lot for this. I consider it a silent colonization of the international minds, and what a what a strong way to put that. And I agree with you. It's there's certainly a form of neocolonialism that happens with this hyper promotion, hyper speed of digital mainstream bombardment at home and abroad. And then just to contrast that a little bit, since you're getting a sense that that's what I or geographers do a lot, just a little bit below that, another student went on to say, and there was more before this in the quote, that English has opened the channel of international communication. And, and I think there's so much ground in that as well. And, you know, um, admittedly or granted, due to the long history of despicable colonization and imperialism that spread English around the world, up through modern U.S. foreign policy and other countries as well. But if we're looking for a means of contrast and taking a step back to see a broader scope, then I think this is a really good point to have added to the conversation. And then going down a little bit further in the discussion, another student goes on to say, this is not so much of a need to speak more than English when living. There's not much of a need to speak more than English when living in the U.S., since there will always be people who speak English. This is sad, since it discourages other languages, which is an identifying trait of every culture. So, and really here, this hit home for me. I feel this also discourages permeability between cultures if languages are not shared. We talked a lot about permeability last week, and it's so great to see, a theme being continued, a key concept, and I think you're exactly right there. And then, we go on here to say, someone adds that in my country, China, where the government does not give people the right to choose, many areas where Mandarin is not the native language are forced to abandon their native languages and then learn Mandarin. Even regions that have a whole separate language system are sadly forced to be considered "quote unquote" one people. And that is a pretty uh, grave illustration of discouraging permeability between cultures. I thought it provided a nice, well, not a nice, but a strong example of the previous share that I included there. Yeah, and so just a few more of these, another, just love the personal stories of people from going around the world, and there's plenty of opportunities to share linguistic insights and add them to the map of, your experiences in the US or, wherever you're living these days. So even if you haven't been to a lot of other countries, but this is really neat to read about the students' experience in Algeria. My parents come from Algeria and would only speak Arabic in the household for my whole life. Good on them. That's great. I then would go to school and socialize strictly in English. The younger you are, the more your mind acts as a sponge and picks things up quickly. And, numerous linguistic studies demonstrate this, but it goes on to say, this happened to me and I quickly picked up fluency in both languages. I honestly think that this transformed my worldview. Every time I travel back to Algeria and visit family, it feels like I've sprung into a whole new life. It goes on to talk about separate you, separate personality characters. So some strong illustrations of representations of these themes that we're working with this week. Another student, learning and speaking other languages truly does give amazing insight into the cultures of other. I've had some of the most lovely experiences of my life during encounters with people who did not speak English, and I was able to communicate with them in Spanish. I lived on a beach in Puerto Rico for months, and it felt like I was able to connect with the Taino people. My apologies if the pronunciation there is wrong, but in a much different way than the friends who I was with who didn't speak Spanish. And then contrasting this to their experience in Thailand. But this such a great addition here. But we were able to communicate effectively with gestures and expressions, which was profound to me. This echoes a bit of, humbly speaking, what I shared about in the discussion board with my experience with the Tibetans and living, staying a night in their yak skin tent, just laughing and doing gestures and all sorts of expressions. And this is so great that this student brought their child to Thailand with them, and I love it. Narak and the Michelin reference. My little 7-month-old looks like Michelin Man in this little sleep sack with arms that we have for her. So and then it goes on to say some other key things we can clue in on here. The whole board was loaded with great examples, but just to highlight some that are presenting a lot of correspondence with what we've been diving into, or just what was stood out a lot here. American English is complex and simple at the same time, which is probably why it's so prevalent. And, so important part of learning here is what my longtime geography prof and mentor, who I first took this course with over 20 years ago, used to say that's great Japanese learning, because he had lived and studied in Japan for so long, and was rewarded for when he would be wrong with something incorrect. And so American English, probably why it's so prevalent, has a lot more to do with colonialism and the British Empire, and then U.S. jumping on the heels of that in foreign policy and other forms of colonization and imperialism around the world in the previous century and into this one, unfortunately. U.S. media complex as well. So that's just great to have shifted our perspective a little bit there. And then, this was awesome. Thanks so much. The student also had an amazing response last week to the little Princess Bride share clip, and it brought me such a smile. But in this world of epic, the word being used too often, it was neat to see you thinking that we had a little Princess Bride clip, all but 3 seconds. It made me curious how many other people are aware of the movie or the cultural significance. But what's fascinating to me is that you learned Mandarin, which I've heard is one of the most difficult languages, before you learned Gaelic. why did I choose to learn Mandarin first? Well, yeah, this was thanks to a senior field research abroad in for my undergrad, going to China, and I took a Chinese for Travelers course before we went. This was 2005, and my eyes were just blown open, my heart blown open by the linguistic diversity there, and the pathways to better understanding and being able to interact with people. I was really intent at that time with helping China's environmental movement as well, and that's why after undergrad I went on to go study Mandarin over in China. It's a bit of a sore spot just because now my grandma has passed. She was from Ireland, and although I'm learning Gaeilge, Irish, very slowly, it's I wish as a much younger in life I would have went to Ireland and studied in the western regions there, where Irish is still the predominant language spoken in what's known as the Gaeltacht, the Gaeilge regions. Gaelic is a bit of a tricky term, but so I didn't realize they still spoke Gaelic in Ireland. I thought it was English with a really cool accent. Yeah, there are a lot of areas it's officially, bilingual. Another student touches on this up ahead here, but it's a lot of linguistic resurgence, linguistic revival in terms of teaching it in schools, and all the government proceedings have to be done within Ireland and in Gaeilge as well, and which is the Irish word for the language, the Irish language, and even at the United Nations, even at the European Union, because Ireland being a member state of the European Union, Irish, all of its proceedings have to be translated into Irish as well. So thanks for that question. That was neat to get a little personal inquiry there. I'm always welcome to those, everyone. And the original and official language of Ireland is Gaelic, but this student goes on to say, but it is now definitely a minority language spoken in the country. That's true. After Northern Ireland's merge into the UK, the majority of people started to speak English for mostly business regions. And so this is another, great Japanese learning moment where I need to, correct the flow here a little bit, in that Ireland's merge, if we want to use that word, unfortunately had to be forfeited to the UK based on the War of Independence and in 1919 to 1921, the 6 counties in the north of Ireland. That was a bit of the compromise to end the war. It's still a large effort towards reunification across the island. Not shared with everyone in the north, unionist, but especially here, what I want to correct is the majority of people started to speak English. Well, that for hundreds of years, starting especially in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, Irish started to be beaten and annihilated out of the Irish people by the English, and brutal history of colonialism there, and so extreme language suppression, and it's pretty incredible that it survived where it did. And just a little bit of correction there. And then I like to be multilingual. This other student goes on to say, the clock's ticking down here, but I'll skip to this. You definitely have a different understanding when you say China in English, when you say 中国 in Chinese. And this is just such a great example. Thank you so much for this. 非常感谢. And this is because that the first character there, 中 means central, and in China, in Chinese, The word for China is said literally translates as central kingdom. And that's why this student makes this great point.